So let's get on to categories. So I'm going to be talking about categories as puzzle pieces. We're bringing back the puzzle pieces for those of you that were in the bio webinar that you can pull from. So again, like Miranda was asking about the education puzzle piece, education category, if it serve you, don't choose that puzzle piece, right? And that's the same for all of the different categories that we're going to be presenting. So you're going to choose from those in order to create the unique puzzle of your own CV or your resume. So none of the category puzzle pieces are mandatory, except for your name and your contact info. That is mandatory, but everything else, not mandatory. Some categories I'm going to cover first because they are general to and common to all of us, but even those are not mandatory. I'm just covering them first because they could show up for any of us, whether you're a musician, an actor, a director, a writer, whoever you are, you might have this category on your resume or your CV. Some categories are specific to particular artistic realms. So I'm going to color those puzzle pieces orange because some of, like if you're a musician, you're not going to have an exhibition list, for instance. So those will be orange if they're specific. So the categories are not mandatory. Also, the order is not mandatory. Like I said, your order is going to be specific to you. They should be arranged and rearranged in order to highlight both your experience and whatever purpose you are currently going after. So that's going to change depending on what you're doing and where you are in your career and also what you're applying for. All right, so here's the general categories that any of us could have but don't have to have on our resume or CV. Name and contact info, education and or training, awards, honors, grants, fellowships and or residencies, and references. A note about references is I put it on here because it's a common thing on CVs and resumes, but often you probably won't have it on your CV or resume. And that's because if it is, you won't include it if it's not asked for and whatever you're applying for. You won't include it if it's a publicly available CV or resume because you don't want to put your references information out there. And you won't include it if you're submitting it as another part of the application. So say a grant asks for references, but they're having you submit it through the online system that you apply through, or they want a separate document which has your references listed, then you don't need to put it on your CV or resume. And those things are very common. So it might not even be on there. If it is on there, I would make sure that if it's on like a standing resume that you're sending out to a lot of people, I might just leave off your references contact information until you're submitting something specific if they're asking for references specifically. But we'll go through the rest of these categories one by one. So name and contact info, it seems easy enough, but just to go through it really quickly. Your name, again, large, think 22 plus. And the plus, emphasis on the plus, make it really big on the page. And then you'll have your mailing address. Maybe, again, you don't want your mailing address to be publicly available. So that's optional. Definitely leave it off if it's going to be online or something like that. Your phone numbers, again, decide how public you want that to be. Email address and your personal website. There are some of you, like if you're a writer that has a good social media following, you might go ahead and put your social media handles within this section as well. So here's an example of what that might look like. You see that a lot of the contact information is squished onto one line. Excellent, perfect. You want it to take up as little vertical space as possible because you want to get to your bread and butter category as quickly as possible. And we'll talk about what those are in a minute, but you want to get to the impressive stuff fast. So you don't want to take up half a page with your contact information by listing everything on separate lines. Get as much onto as few lines as you possibly can. Education or training, if you've got it. We already talked about the ordering of like what's in them, of the entries in them. But as far as where it goes in your CV, or your resume, if you're including it, it is usually either first or last, and you can make that decision by how relevant it is to whatever you're applying for. The item, we already talked about that. And then if relevant, you can also list honors and or distinctions, studio concentrations, advisors, if you had a thesis or a dissertation, the title of that or the topic of it, and then your instrumental or vocal teachers you'd want to include as well. All right, so here's an example of a very formal education and what that might look like for those of you that went this route. Like you can see, it's not perfectly reverse chronology because the last two items on the list didn't end in degrees. And then you can see also they're not quite done with their MFA. They're a candidate, it says. You can also say like forthcoming or whatever, however you want to word that. And then they have an honor cum laude for their BA listed as well. If you studied with folks, like I was mentioning earlier, but it wasn't like a formal art education, but you want to list that, you can say studied under and list them there. So whether that's in the context of a institution or not, you can still list it like this. And if you're self-trained and you don't have to have this category at all. And that's totally common and totally fine, because even if you had a degree and it wasn't relevant, you might leave it off anyway. So you're not going to be alone by any means. It's very common to not have an education section. All right, and then the awards, honors, grants, fellowships, and residencies. Again, not uncommon to not have this, puzzle piece, but if you do have something, include it. And you're going to sort of select from this list when you're choosing your category title. So let's say you won one award and you've gotten a grant. You would title it awards and grants and list those two things. If you've gotten, one residency and one award, awards and residencies. But let's say you're very established in your career and you have 10 awards and 4 residencies, then I'd say list them separately. Have an award section and then a residency section. Remember that 2 to 10 entries per title range. And if you have enough to warrant having those as separate sections, I would absolutely say put them as separate sections.